Okay, good. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katelyn Cooper. Dr. Cooper did her undergrad at Arizona State. She also did her PhD and her postdoc there. But of course, like so many of the people that we have speak at Rose meetings, she switched from biochemistry to undergrad biology education research in her graduate studies. And of course, she worked with Sarah Brownell, who I think most of us are pretty familiar with. So from 2017 to 2019, she coordinated a program at Arizona State called LEAP, the LEAP Scholars Program, which is focused on getting community college students into undergrad research, again, which is something that Rose is very interested in. And in August of 2019, so just a few months ago, she started as an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Cooper has written quite a few papers that generated a lot of buzz and a lot of interest, both in academia and just in the regular popular press. So we're really excited to see what she has to say today. She's going to talk to us about factors that predict student persistence in research, from lab environment to mental health. All right, so Dr. Cooper.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for virtually having me at UAB today. So I'm very excited to present some of my work today focused on identifying factors that predict student persistence in undergraduate research and ranging from lab environment to mental health. So as many of folks who are probably here know, undergraduate research leads to an array of benefits for those who participate. Specifically, it's been shown to enhance students' ability to think critically, to enhance student learning, and to increase students' odds of obtaining a bachelor's degree and of entering a STEM graduate or professional program. Further, we know that the longer an undergraduate stays in research, the more likely they are to experience particular benefits. For example, students who spend more time in undergraduate research experiences show greater gains in research skills such as analyzing data, problem solving, and identifying flaws in the interpretation of data. They also show an increased comfort working with others and an increased ability to work independently. And finally, they show increased confidence in their ability to succeed in graduate school. Therefore, if longer undergraduate research experiences lead to more benefits for students, we began to wonder, why do so many of our students end up leaving their undergraduate research experiences prematurely? So we really set out to assess the challenges of undergraduate research experiences. And today I want to present to you 3 projects. The first focuses on why students consider leaving their undergrad research experiences. And the second 2 focus on how student mental health, specifically anxiety and depression, affect student undergraduate research experiences. All right, so we're going to begin with why students consider leaving their undergrad research experiences. So to answer this question, we surveyed 768 life sciences majors across 26 public research-intensive institutions in the US. And all of these students were currently participating in or had previously participated in an undergraduate research experience during their academic year. On the survey, we first asked students whether they had ever considered leaving their undergraduate research experience. And if they had thought about leaving, we asked them whether they actually had left their research. This allowed us to classify students in 3 ways. So first, we classified students as stayers, or students who had never considered leaving research. We also classified students as waivers, or students who considered leaving their undergraduate research experience but ultimately chose to stay. And finally, leavers, or students who chose to leave their undergraduate research experience. So on the survey, we asked both the stayers and the waivers, or all students who were still in their undergraduate research experience, what factors caused them to stay in their open-ended or in their undergraduate research experience. And this was an open-ended question, so they could write as much as they wanted. Then, using data we had from a pilot study, we had identified a list of 11 potential factors that caused students to stay in undergraduate research, and after students answered their open-ended questions, we gave them these factors and asked them to choose all that applied to them. Additionally, we took all students who had considered leaving research, so both the waivers and the leavers, and we gave them an open-ended question asking them what factors caused them to consider leaving their undergraduate research experience. And then again, we presented them with a list of predetermined factors and asked them to select all that apply. Further, we collected demographic information from students, specifically their gender, their race ethnicity, their college generation status, and their grade point average. So to analyze these data, we coded all student open-ended responses to the questions about why students chose to stay in research and why students chose to leave research. And we found that these students' responses really reflected the 11 predetermined reasons why they might have chosen to stay in research or why they considered leaving. And therefore, because our qualitative data really seem to reflect our quantitative data, today I'm going to focus mainly on our quantitative results and support them with quotes from our open-ended questions. And finally, we used logistic regression to test to what extent student demographics predicted whether students reported specific reasons for staying in their research or why they considered leaving. All right, so I know we have a little bit of a different format today. So if you're near someone, I'm gonna ask you to turn to your neighbor and I want you to talk about what % of students consider leaving their undergraduate research experience. And then once you land on the % of students, go ahead and discuss what do you think are the most common reasons for why students consider leaving undergraduate research. And if you're not near a neighbor or you're at home, go ahead and just think through these questions to yourself.
Considered leaving. Or let alone.
During my undergrad experience, I don't.
Okay, so we can go ahead and come back together, and I want you to compare what you talked about or what you thought about to what we found. So first, we were surprised to learn that 50% of our students had thought about leaving their undergraduate research experience. But why? So why do students consider leaving? Well, first, we found that 44% of students highlighted that they didn't actually enjoy what they were doing every day. They didn't enjoy their research tasks. So for example, student 290 said, I was not very interested in what I was asked to do in lab. And here we found that male students were 1.7 times more likely than female students to consider leaving research because they do not enjoy their everyday research tasks. Further, we found that for every 1 point increase in a student's GPA, they were 2.3 times more likely to consider leaving because they don't enjoy their research tasks. So here we hypothesize that our students with lower GPAs know that their odds of getting into research are much lower, so they're much more reluctant to leave for a reason like they don't like what they're doing. Additionally, we found that 39% of students were interested in another research opportunity. So this is actually a really positive reason that students are leaving, right? Students 14 said, I considered leaving just because I became more interested in infectious disease research and microbiology than the genetics research we were doing. 38% of students highlighted that they simply didn't have enough time to do research. So student 6 said, I was working a part-time job and taking full-time classes along with research, and my grades began to suffer as a result. So here it's perhaps unsurprising that for every 1 point decrease in a student's GPA, they were 2.1 times more likely to consider leaving because they felt like they didn't have enough time to do research. 32% of students highlighted that they didn't have sufficient guidance for their research project. So student 199 said, my mentor provided me with very little training. I felt as if she had no time to meet with me or provide hands-on guidance. Not once during this time did she check my procedures or results. And finally, we found that students' mentor, so this could be their PI, their postdoc, their grad student, or a staff member who was in charge of their research, was the reason that they considered leaving. So student 345 says, the supervisor would constantly berate me and the other undergrads about how we were not good enough and were lazy. We were not. So given that we had these different factors that were affecting students and causing them to consider leaving, we were interested in which of these factors predicted whether a student would actually leave, would actually walk out the door of their research experience. And so we conducted a logistic regression to see whether selecting any of the 11 factors predicted whether a student would actually leave their undergrad research. We found that students who reported a negative lab environment were 1.6 times more likely to choose to leave their undergrad research experiences than students who did not report a negative lab environment. Additionally, we found that students who were not gaining important skills or knowledge were 2.1 times more likely to leave their URE than students who did not report this. All right, so now that we've identified factors that cause students to consider leaving their undergraduate research experience, I want you to go ahead and talk to your neighbor or think to yourself, what do you think are the most common reasons for why students report that they're staying in their undergraduate research experience? All right, so we'll go ahead and compare again what you talked about with your neighbor or what you thought about to what we actually found. So the most, 85% of our students highlighted that gaining important skills or knowledge was why they were staying. So they felt like they were learning, there was more to learn. Student 554 said, I felt like there were many things I could learn and practice. And here we found that continuing generation college students were 1.9 times more likely than first generation college students to stay in research because they're gaining important skills or knowledge. Further, we found that 84% of students said that research is important for their future career. So we all know these pre-meds really well. Student 72 said, I am currently staying because I require research experience for medical school. And here we found that male students were 1.9 times more likely than female students to stay in research because it was important for their future career. We also found that 82% of students reported that they stay in research because the lab is flexible with their time and schedule. So student 449 said, my lab is really nice about being understanding of my schedule as a student and all the other time commitments I have. Students excitingly highlighted that their mentor not only can cause them to think about leaving, but also can cause them to consider staying. So for example, student 582 said, my mentor cares for me not only as a research assistant, but as a person. And finally, students highlighted that they were interested in the research topic and therefore chose to stay. So student 710 said, I love the work that we do. I'm genuinely interested in the results/projects. All right, so once again, we were really interested in given these factors that cause students to consider staying, what are the factors that cause students to never ever consider leaving at all? So again, we conducted a logistic regression to see whether selecting any of the 11 factors predicted whether a student had not considered leaving their undergraduate research experience. And we found that students who reported a positive lab environment were 2.7 times more likely to consider leaving their undergrad research experience than students who did not report a positive lab environment. And further, students who reported enjoying their everyday research tasks were two times more likely to not consider leaving their first undergraduate research experience than students who did not report enjoying their everyday research tasks. So in sum, we identified a suite of frequently reported factors that cause students to stay in their undergraduate research experience. And we also identified factors that significantly predict whether a student would never consider leaving their undergrad research. Further, we identified a suite of factors that students reported caused them to consider leaving their undergraduate research and factors that significantly predicted whether a student would actually leave their research. All right, so we saw some similarities here, and the first was really with timing. So we saw that students are leaving because they don't have enough time. However, for those that feel that their lab is flexible with their schedule, that's why they're staying. Further, mentors can be good and bad, which we all know, right? So we saw some students are staying because of their positive mentoring experience. However, some mentors are the reason that students are considering leaving. We were glad to see that students were leaving because they were interested in their topic, and students were staying because they were interested in what they were doing in the lab. And then students also need to enjoy what they're doing, right? This was the most common reason that students were leaving. Similarly, gaining knowledge and skills. So students are staying because they feel like they're getting something out of their experience. But I really want to hone in on this idea of positive lab environments, because we saw that our students who have really positive lab environments, meaning they have good relationships with others, they feel like the overall environment of the lab is positive, were our students who are most likely to never consider leaving. However, if our students had a bad lab environment, a negative lab environment, they were most likely to walk out the door and actually leave that research experience. All right, so now that we've thought about why students consider leaving their research experience, I want to dive in a little deeper and start to think about how student mental health, so specifically student anxiety, can affect undergraduate researchers. There's prior literature out there that suggests that student anxiety can negatively affect undergraduates in science. And therefore, that got us thinking that student anxiety in research may be affecting students' persistence in research careers. So specifically, we chose to explore research anxiety in the context of undergraduate research experiences. We were interested in exploring how research anxiety, or the feelings of worry and apprehension that are associated with working on research projects in the context of a faculty member research lab, can affect the extent to which students plan to pursue a career in research. And we also wanted to control for research difficulty, or students' perceptions that the research is complicated, difficult, and complex, because we hypothesized that sure, some students might be anxious, and that might be because they have naturally more difficult projects, or they perceive that their research is more difficult. So our research questions were, what is the relationship between research difficulty, research anxiety, and student intent to pursue a research career? And to what extent do student demographics, namely gender, race, ethnicity, and GPA, predict research difficulty, research anxiety, and student intention to pursue a research career? So to answer these research questions, we created a survey that consisted of closed-ended questions, which measured student demographics, student research anxiety, student research difficulty, student current intention to pursue a research career. And we also asked students to think back before they began their undergraduate research experience and report their intention to pursue a research career at that time. We also gave students two open-ended questions measuring the factors, asking them what factors increase their anxiety in research and what factors decrease their anxiety in research. And then we surveyed 1,272 biology majors across 87 US colleges and universities who were participating in an undergraduate research experience during the academic year. And we used structural equation modeling to answer the research questions. All right, so first we were interested in whether gender, race, ethnicity, or GPA predict how difficult a student might perceive their research to be. And here we found that compared to white students, underrepresented racial minority students, or URN students, perceived their research as less difficult. We also found that students with higher GPAs perceived their research as more difficult. So it's possible our students with higher GPAs are coming in and getting given more difficult projects. But what about research anxiety? So here we established some really novel relationships. We found that females report higher research anxiety than males. And it's well known in the academic community that females have greater anxiety on average than males, but this had never been established in the unique context of undergraduate research. Additionally, we also found that underrepresented racial minority students reported higher research anxiety than white students. And this was when we controlled for research difficulty. So the more difficult a student perceives their research to be, the more anxiety they're likely to have. All right, so what does the relationship look like between research difficulty, research anxiety, and students' intention to pursue a career in research? Here we found that the more difficult a student perceives their research to be, the more likely they are to pursue a research career. So again, you can envision that our students who are really excited about going on in research may end up with more difficult projects down the line. However, we found that the more research anxiety a student has, the less likely they are to pursue a career in research. So this is a really novel find, and that it shows us something that we can potentially work to change to encourage students to consider careers in scientific research. And these relationships were true even when we controlled for students' prior intent to pursue a career in research. And in more complex models, which I haven't presented today, we also controlled for a student's year in school and the length of time they had been in research, and these results still held true. All right, so because we established that anxiety in research affects a student's decision to pursue a career in research, we wanted to know what increases and decreases student research anxiety. So I want you to go ahead and turn to your neighbor and discuss, given your experience as an undergraduate and or as a graduate researcher, what do you think increases and decreases student anxiety in research?
You want to do me a favor and see if you can find a source for acetyl phosphate, like to purchase pure acetyl phosphate? Because I've been looking and I have not found anything. Every once in a while, you go too far down your own rabbit hole to find something, and then someone else Googles it. It's right here.
I think we may have some feedback from some other participants, but that's okay. So let's go ahead and come back together. And let's talk about, so actually in order to come up with these factors that increase and decrease student anxiety in research, we coded the 1,272 open-ended student factors that increase and decrease their research anxiety. And I will present the percent of students who report out each factor. But do keep in mind that because this question was open-ended, we're likely underreporting the number of students whose anxiety was affected by a particular factor. And additionally, we use logistic regression to determine to what extent student demographics predicted whether students wrote about a particular factor that increased or decreased their anxiety. All right, so what factors increase student anxiety? First, we found a lack of research success, and specifically 40% of our students highlighted that experiencing failure and making mistakes increased their anxiety. So for example, student 51 said, "What increases my anxiety is being stressed about why a reaction will not work and seeing you did everything right but can't seem to figure out what could have went wrong." Additionally, 34% of students highlighted a lack of knowledge, and that was what increased their anxiety, and that could be about a particular research topic or how to do a technique. So for example, student 37 said, "Being sent to come up with my own ideas, I didn't feel secure enough. It increases my anxiety." Here we see that time issue again. So 14% of students said that time balance increases their anxiety. They just had too much on their plate to juggle. So student 166 says, I want to put a lot of work into research because I care about it, but also not at the expense of my classes. I sometimes feel as if I don't have enough time to do everything. And finally, we found that people can increase student research anxiety. Specifically, 14% of our students highlighted that they had insufficient mentor guidance, which could increase their anxiety. Student 176 said, "My faculty advisor frequently made me feel stupid for asking questions to clarify what I was supposed to do. Additionally, not having any real guidance made the whole situation more anxious." And here we established that females were 2.1 times more likely than males to report that insufficient guidance increased their anxiety. We also found that about 8% of students highlighted that a negative response from others can increase their anxiety. So student 700 said, my PI gets super mad very unpredictably, and I always live in fear of the day I get yelled at. We found that 5% of students highlighted that merely interacting with their PI can cause anxiety. So for example, student 692 said, I was paralyzed with fear about my poor mental math skills, which my PI would often quiz us on. A silly thing to be nervous about, but something that when I messed up, I felt so small. We also found that 5% of students highlighted the lab environment, and we talked about the lab environment, so their relationships with other students and other people in the lab besides the PI, and just the overall feeling of the lab. So student 523 said, being in a lab environment where I consistently felt different from my peers because I wasn't close friends with any of them and they were all close-knit, increased my anxiety. And here, interestingly, we found that Asian students were 3.2 times more likely, and underrepresented racial minority students were 3.5 times more likely than white students to report that the lab environment increased their anxiety. All right. So what factors actually help alleviate anxiety? So what factors help decrease student anxiety? Well, 12% of students highlighted that research progress decreases their anxiety. So for example, student 201 said, completing small tasks in the lab gave me a sense of accomplishment and it felt good to be able to cross things off my list. 13% of students highlighted that preparation and knowledge decreased their anxiety. So the more prepared they felt, the more knowledgeable they were. Example, student 2 said, after doing different tasks a few times, I would get a lot more confident in my abilities and not feel as anxious. 5% of students highlighted that flexible schedule was important in causing their anxiety to go down. So student 379 said, the flexibility in lab schedule is very helpful. As long as I'm able to come up to the lab for the amount of hours I'm assigned to, it doesn't matter the exact times I come in. And finally, people. So again, this is encouraging. Not only do people increase anxiety, but they can also decrease anxiety. Specifically, 28% of students highlighted a positive lab environment could decrease anxiety. So student 744 said, the overall encouragement from everyone in the lab helped. They believe in me when I don't see my worth as a budding scientist. 27% of students highlighted that if they have a positive relationship with their mentor, this could really decrease their anxiety. Student 417 said, my postdoc has been invaluable during my times of stress, and we fostered a good working relationship. A quarter of students highlighted that they had sufficient guidance, and that was really key to decreasing anxiety. Student 38 said, my mentor helped me with any questions I had, and the training that I underwent on how to handle different procedures in the lab helped a lot. And we found that praise and encouragement in particular was really helpful for students. So for example, student 129 said, encouragement, support, and validation from my mentors, both graduate level and the PI, have always helped decrease my feelings of anxiousness. And finally, 9% of students mentioned how norming aspects of research could decrease anxiety. And what I mean by this is just something that we as PIs or graduate researchers may think to be normal in the lab, undergrads often don't think is normal. And so helping them realize that failure is normal, that research takes time, things like that can be really helpful. So for example, student 618 said, my mentor explained that there's always a possibility that I could have done everything right and things just don't work out. I would also feel better when I saw my mentor mess up because then I know it isn't just me making mistakes. So in conclusion, we identified that research difficulty positively predicted student research anxiety, which then negatively predicted a student's intent to pursue a research career. And we identified a suite of factors that increase anxiety as well as a suite of factors that decrease anxiety. And as you may have noticed, these factors ended up being related. So we see that progress is really important to students. They get more anxious when they're not making progress, but as their research progress increases, they seem to get less anxious. Further, when students feel like they don't know anything, they're unprepared, that causes them anxiety, but when we can help them be prepared and help them be more knowledgeable, that can decrease anxiety. We see this time balance again, right? Students are feeling more anxious because they can't juggle everything, but if they have a flexible lab schedule, that certainly helps. And finally, people, right? So people can be really, really harmful in terms of increasing students' anxiety, but then they can also be really important in helping our undergraduates feel less anxious in the lab. All right, so finally, I'd like to discuss depression in undergraduate research. And as you may or may not know, depression is one of the top undergraduate mental health concerns, and the rate of depression among undergraduates continues to rise. And in fact, the percent of US college students affected by depression was recently estimated to be 25%. However, higher rates have been reported, with one study estimating that up to 84% of our undergraduates have experienced at least mild depression. Further, depression has become a prominent concern for students conducting scientific research. Specifically, the graduate student mental health crisis has recently garnered the attention of the international scientific community in an effort to improve the experiences of science graduate students. However, what's talked about much less often is that our undergraduates in the US report identical levels of depression to our graduate students, and yet they're less likely to receive mental health care services. So this got us thinking, there's all this talk about grad student depression, and we're very grateful for these efforts that are really being made to improve the mental health of graduate students. But if we take a step back and look about where this depression is really stemming from and how some real sources of the problem, we were really interested in how depression affects students in undergraduate research experiences. So to answer this research question, we recruited 35 undergraduate researchers from 12 research-intensive institutions who self-identified as having depression. And we conducted hour-long semi-structured interviews that explored students' experiences with depression in the unique context of undergraduate research. We used inductive coding to identify themes in the interviews, and I will report out on the themes that were reported by at least 20% of our students. So we found that depression in research really was affected by a couple of factors. First was the lab environment and social connections. So specifically, students highlighted that they struggled with depression when they were alone in the lab, which could lead them to focus on negative thoughts. So for example, student 28 said, "Oftentimes when I go to my office in the evening, that's when I would be prone to be more depressed. It's being alone. I think about myself or mistakes or trying to correct my mistakes or whatever's going on in my life at the time. I become very introspective. I think I'm way too self-evaluating, way too self-deprecating. And it's when I'm alone when these things are really triggered. When I'm talking with somebody else, I forget about those things." However, we found that positive social interactions with others in the lab really seem to help students' depression. So for example, student 1 said, "I think always checking in on undergrads is important. It's really easy for us to go a whole day without talking to anybody in the lab. But our grad students are like, hey, what's up? How's school? What's going on? What helps me the most is having that strong support system. Sometimes just talking makes you feel better, but also having people that believe in you and can really help you get out of that negative spiral. I think that can really help with depression." Specifically, students highlighted that they found it especially helpful when their research mentors shared their own struggles, right? So for example, student 3 said, "Talking with my PI is helpful because he would talk about his struggles and what he faced. A lot of it was very similar to my struggles. For example, he would say, oh yeah, I failed this exam and I studied so hard for. I failed the GRE. I paid so much money to prepare for it. It just makes my depression better. Like, okay, this is normal for students to go through this. It's not an out of this world thing where if you fail, you're a failure and you can't move on from it." However, students described many instances where the negative moods of their mentor would often set the tone for the whole lab, which in turn worsened the mood of the undergraduate researchers. So we really saw a trickle-down effect. If the PI is in a bad mood, the grad students are in a bad mood, then it affects the undergraduate. So for example, student 4 describes this well. They say, Sometimes the grad students are not in a good mood. The entire vibe of the lab is just off and they get all mad. It really depends on the grad students and the leadership and the mood that they're in. Further, we found that while some students describe mentors who were just generally in a bad mood, others described harmful relationships that affected their depression. So for example, student 11 said, I had a primary investigator who's notorious in the department for screaming at people, being emotionally abusive, unreasonable, etc. He was kind of harassing people, demeaning them, lying to them. Being yelled at and constantly demeaned and harassed at all hours of the day and night, that was probably pretty bad for me. In addition to the lab environment and social connections, we also found that failing in science, making errors, getting help, and receiving feedback can also affect student depression. Specifically, students highlighted that their depression often worsened when science failed. So for example, here the interviewer asked the student, considering your experience in undergraduate research, what tends to trigger your feelings of depression? And student 25 said, probably just not getting things right, having to do an experiment over and over again. You don't get the results you want. The work is pretty meticulous and it's frustrating when I do a whole experiment and then I don't get any results that I can use. That can be really frustrating. It's hard because you did all this other stuff before so you can plan for the research, so you have time to do all that stuff, and then something happens and all the stuff you did was basically worthless. Further, students highlighted that if they experienced failure, it was especially challenging if they felt like they couldn't ask anyone for help, right? So student 6 highlights as well. They say, it just feels like the graduate students are not approachable. I feel like I can't approach them to ask for their understanding in a certain situation. It makes my depression worse because I feel like I'm stuck. I feel like I'm being limited and that there's nothing I can do. So then I kind of feel like it's my fault that I can't do anything. And we also saw that simply making mistakes in research can trigger students' depression. So for example, student 4 says, I guess making mistakes on experiments can affect my depression. Not necessarily that your experiment didn't turn out to produce the data that you wanted, but just adding the wrong enzyme or messing something up like that. It's like, oh man, you know, you can get really down on yourself about that because it can be embarrassing. But we found that making mistakes was really bad for students' depression, depending on how their mentor responded. So if their mentor responded to a mistake in a negative way, this could have a really detrimental effect for students. So for example, student 17 describes, sometimes if I made a mistake in correctly identifying an eye color of a fly, my PI would just ridicule me in front of the other students. He corrected me, but his method of correcting was very discouraging because it was a ridicule. It made the other students laugh, and I didn't like that. We also found that students described that it can be especially helpful for them when their mentors praise them when they're doing a good job. So we found that students with depression, this has been well established, can be incredibly hard on themselves, right? And so they often describe themselves as their biggest critic. So they're already incredibly critical of themselves. So when others praise them, it can mean so much and really, really work wonders in helping them feel less depressed or experience fewer depressive symptoms. So for example, the interviewer said, why is hearing praise from your mentor helpful? And student 16 replied, because a lot of my depression focuses on everybody secretly hates you, nobody likes you, you're going to die alone. So having that validation from my graduate mentor is important because it flies in the face of whatever my depression tells me. So in sum, we identified that the lab environment and social connections could affect student depression in undergraduate research, but also failing in science, making errors, getting help, and receiving feedback can also affect depression. So in conclusion, given these 3 studies, we identified 4 prominent factors that seem to affect students. And now those allow us to think more deeply about what we can do as mentors to alleviate some of these primary challenges. So first, we highlighted insufficient guidance. And this insufficient guidance not only increased student anxiety, it can also increase student depression, and it caused students to leave their research. So it's really easy to say provide sufficient guidance, right? But I think the key here is that we need to provide guidance that our undergraduates think is sufficient. And I know what I think is sufficient is often very different from what my undergrad thinks is sufficient. So it reminds me to really make sure that I'm checking in with my undergrads and making sure that they feel that they have enough guidance, right? And so it's really their perceptions that's most important. Further, we found that students highlighted that a lack of skill and knowledge can really increase their anxiety and also cause them to leave research. And so here we suggest backward designing student research experiences to ensure that students gain skills or knowledge, right? So for those who are familiar with backward designing the classroom, this is the idea that we start with our end goal, we start with what we want students to know, and we backward design our class so that we make sure we're going to get them to that end goal. So we've argued that we should actually be thinking more and more about backward designing our undergrad research experiences, especially if we are giving students credit and they're paying for that credit in exchange for this research experience where they're supposed to come out knowing something and learning something. So if we start backward designing the research experience, that might look like thinking, you know, I really want this student to learn R, and making sure that then they're trained up on that particular program and we're giving them the exercises that they need to be proficient in a particular program. So we really just want to start thinking more about how we can be thoughtful about backward designing undergrad research experiences so we make sure that they're leaving with those skills and knowledge. That's really important. Additionally, students talked a lot about negative mentoring relationships because it can both increase anxiety and depression and also cause students to leave their research. So it's pretty simple to say build relationships, right? And I think that that was one of the findings that affected me most from this study is students saying, simply saying hi to me is really important. And I know that sometimes I'll come into the lab and I'll be interested in talking to a particular student, I'll go right to them. But it really caused me to reflect and make sure that I take time to interact with not only the grad students, but also the undergrads, and try to really build those relationships and encourage my graduate students to do the same. And finally, to praise and encourage mentees. So I think I'm the first to admit that I'm really good at telling students what they do wrong, and I often forget to integrate that element of praise. I'll say it to others, I'll say in my head how great these students are, but you know, these studies have really caused me to think about working on verbalizing that praise to the students. And finally, a negative lab environment. So we saw that this was really important in that it can affect students in causing them to want to leave their undergraduate research experience, but it can also increase their anxiety. So I think the important takeaway here is remembering that the PIs, you know, really set the tone of the lab, and then it's the graduate students and the postdocs as well. And so making sure that, you know, the tone of the lab feels as positive as possible, and to really you know, kind of emulate that for the other people, and making sure that, you know, overall the lab doesn't feel too dark or too upset, because that affects our undergrads, even though they may not talk too much about it. All right, so with that, I would like to thank my collaborators, Dr. Sarah Brownell, Dr. Sarah Eddy, Logan Jin. And also the anxiety study was done as part of a course-based undergraduate research experience in biology education research. So these students here, these NSF LEAP scholars, these students actually worked on this biology education research project on anxiety as part of a course. And so we're really proud of them, and we're really excited that they were our collaborators with this project. And with that, I will take any questions.
We've got plenty of time for questions, guys. So turn on the lights so Katelyn can see us. Questions? Well, I'll start then. I've got one. So I don't know, you probably can't tell this from any of the data that you've collected. I'm just wondering if you have a feeling. You know, so we know there's a lot of anxiety and depression in the undergrad population, but presumably that's as time goes by going to filter up into the grad student population and then into the professor population, right? Do you have any feeling whether, like, sort of, you know, mental health issues with the professors or the PIs or the grad students create like kind of like a, you know, I guess it's like it's kind of infectious to the other people in the lab or anything?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So thinking about, this idea that depression and anxiety may, grad students have anxiety and depression, and a lot of faculty may have anxiety and depression, and how does that affect the tone of the lab and undergraduates? Well, we did do a study with an interview study with undergraduates with depression, and we actually asked them whether or not they reveal their depression in the undergraduate research lab and what factors affect that. And interestingly, students picked up on this idea that depression, we asked them how common they think depression is in science, and they think it's pretty common. So they talked a lot about how they saw signs in their grad students of depression, and they, might talk about, they often did not talk about depression openly, but often exhibited a lot of the signs of melancholy and being upset, and just genuinely being unhappy. And students picked up on that, and they also saw some signs in faculty. They didn't talk as often about that. But what was interesting is very few students actually knew that they could say that they knew a scientist with depression. So that tells you that it may be present, but nobody's talking about it and nobody's norming it. So we're really interested in exploring that further, and why and why do faculty share their depression with students, and why do they conceal it? But yeah, so in sum, I think that students do pick up on some of these signs of depression, but I think it's really hard for them when often people aren't admitting to having depression, because then the student feels isolated, but yet they do feel like this might be something that they're going to experience in science.
I mean, from my own perspective, right? I mean, like tenure is stressful, right? And it's always been sort of a question to me, like how much of that do you want your graduate students to know about, right? It's like on the one hand, it's like you kind of feel like they need to be prepared if they decide to go this route. But on the other, it's almost like it just seems kind of like wrong or something, or whatever. You should try and hide it, and not
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Well, what was interesting for us is I think that they pick up on it, and they'll pick up that it's stressful, but they won't necessarily realize that someone has experienced actual depression. And so what I think can be really powerful in what they said is that on the rare occasion someone shares with them that they have depression, that can be incredibly empowering, because they realize that even though this faculty member maybe struggled with tenure or realized how stressful it is, they made it, right? Even though they have depression, they could still make it in science. And I think that was really powerful for some of our students. And additionally, they said that they were more likely to reveal their identity when anyone in the lab, particularly grad students, reveal that they struggled with any type of mental health issue. And so that really got us thinking, they're perceiving that they get that academia is hard, they realize that research is stressful, but often they don't recognize that people with anxiety and depression persist and do really well in academia. It's just still pretty stigmatized and not talked about as much yet. So we're interested in exploring those ideas further as we go.
Yeah. So to what degree do IDPs with undergrads pose some solution?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So IDP. So to what degree does like an IDP, I guess, an individual development plan? Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Do you think that would help, or?
Yeah, that's a great point. So an individual development plan, is that Sarah over there?
Yes.
Okay, Sarah, I can barely see you, but I can still see you. Can you explain to me more what you mean by an individual development plan?
So at least with grad students, I mean, I don't think I've ever actually made one, but it's recommended by our graduate school to have IDPs for graduate students, and I think it's a little bit more popular with postdocs to make sure that they're sort of meeting semesterly goals towards their, I mean, you talked about making sure that we're backwards designing the undergraduate research experience, and so IDPs sort of serve as a backwards design for graduate students and for postdocs to ensure that you're making like benchmark progress towards your like long-term objective. And it doesn't really seem like there's a similar format for undergraduate students, so there's not as much attention paid to whether or not they're following their professional goals, at least in a research setting.
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal idea. I really, really like that idea of providing those for undergrads because I agree with you. What's so fascinating, grad students are often getting paid, right? And yet they still have these personal professional development goals. And yet our undergrads are usually volunteering or getting credit that they're paying for. To actually have this experience. So being able to have something like an individual professional development plan or an individual development plan that they can look at and think about whether they're gaining the skills that they set out to, I think could be really, really powerful because a lot of times students don't, it's hard to say, right? When students say that they're not gaining skills, is it that they're not gaining skills? Or is it they don't realize some of the skills that they are gaining, right? And it's probably both. And so I think something like the individual development plan could be a really powerful tool in helping both the grad student or the undergrad and their mentor track whether or not the students are meeting their goals. And that's the number one reason, right? They're gaining skills and knowledge that they're staying. So I think that that could be really cool.
Any other questions? All right, let's thank Dr. Cooper one more time.